Good morning, everyone. It's really good to see everyone this morning. It's wonderful to be back in person. This is our first Poverty Alliance annual conference in person since 2019. I'm glad to see that all of you are here and have made it through the last few years. We've got some really important discussions to have today, both looking back over the last 30 years of the Poverty Alliance, but also, I think perhaps more importantly, looking forward. We're in a time of deep crisis, I think, but there are things that we know that we can do, that we can change to really have a bigger impact on addressing poverty in Scotland. I'm not going to go through the housekeeping. You know that if there's a fire alarm, the amazing staff at the Royal Concert Hall will help us out of here. There's no test planned, all that kind of thing. If you could put your phones on silent, that'd be great. But do remember to tweet. There's a hashtag up there. And finally, just enjoy the day. Enjoy the discussion, and I hope that you get a lot out of it. And with no further ado, I am thrilled that the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, is joining us today to give us the opening keynote speech. So, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thank you to all of you for inviting me here this morning. It is lovely to be back in a room full of people after a short interval of 2.5 years. But genuinely a joy, I think, that everybody is experiencing right now to be back with people, having discussions and interactions and just enjoying each other's company. So I hope you very much enjoy the discussions and networking that you're going to be able to do here today. I'm really pleased to be here with you today to help mark the 30th anniversary of the Scottish Poverty Alliance. I think, as Peter has just alluded to, actually, in so many ways, this is a very timely conference. And as you might expect this morning, my remarks will talk about the ways in which the Scottish Government is working to tackle the current cost crisis. I'll also put these comments and actions in the context of our continuing commitment to tackle poverty. That is a key mission for me personally and a key mission for the Scottish Government. And of course, in setting out how we can collectively, working together, achieve that mission, I will also inevitably and inescapably highlight the limitations of Scotland's current constitutional position and briefly set out why I think constitutional change, independence, isn't, as is sometimes by some suggested, a distraction from issues such as tackling poverty. It is actually, in my view, fundamental to the question of how we can better and more effectively tackle poverty, not just the impacts of poverty, but the root causes of it as well. But I want to start this morning by reflecting on this 30th anniversary. For me, and I strongly suspect this will be the case for all of you, it's an anniversary that prompts some mixed feelings. You know, positivity about the fantastic work of this organisation, which I'll come on to talk about, but a deep frustration that an organisation like this, 30 years on, is still necessary. I have, like many of you will, I'm sure, very vivid memories of 1992, the year when the Strathclyde Poverty Alliance, as you were then known, was established. That was the year I graduated from Glasgow University. It was also the year that I first stood for Parliament, for the Westminster Parliament in the general election of that year. I was in that election the youngest candidate in the UK, something that nobody could ever say about me these days. I'll skirt over the outcome of that election because it's not one that I really care to think about. But when I think back on that year and all of the things I was up to that year, it is the case that so many of the things that I was involved in back then are the factors that drove me into politics, are the same factors that prompted and led to the establishment of this organisation. And when I think back to 30 years ago, the stage I was at, and that makes me think about my experiences of growing up and therefore understand the context in which this organisation came into being. I remember I grew up in Ayrshire, not far from here, and I remember to this day the poverty and the lack of opportunity of the people that I was growing up with, the people I was at school with. I remember vividly to this day the ever-present fear of unemployment, what would happen to you if your mum or your dad lost their job, the sense that if that happened they would never get another one. So rampant and so embedded was unemployment and the poverty that it caused. And of course, all of that back then was the result of a government that was allowing, some may say, I would say, let me just be blunt, in many ways encouraging a process of deindustrialisation to happen without any regard at all for the lives or the livelihoods that were being impacted by it. And I mention that because there's a big lesson of that for us today as we embark upon and try to accelerate the process of decarbonisation as we lead the just transition to address the climate emergency. We must make sure that we don't allow that process to happen in the same way that deindustrialisation was allowed to happen back then. I also remember very clearly from those days protests against the poll tax. Of course, I participated in the protests against the poll tax, and also that far wider sense of discontent at the way in which government policies were contributing to poverty and deprivation, or in, as some may say, in a way that was deliberate and not accidental. Indeed, one of the very first reports published by the Poverty Alliance back in 1992, a study of youth poverty in Strathclyde, highlighted what it called the devastating consequences of the abandonment of young people by the state. And I saw that with my own eyes every day as I was growing up, as many of you will have done, in the people around me that I was at school with. So in so many ways, these were the factors that drove me to become involved in politics and the factors that led to me standing here right now. And these are the same factors that the Poverty Alliance came into being to help address and combat. Now, in many ways, and I think it is important to say this, things are better now than they were 30 years ago. And that is often, very often, at least in part, but I would say in large part, down to the hard work and the sheer commitment and dedication of the Alliance. One of your early campaigns was for the introduction of cold weather payments, which back then didn't exist at all. They're now, I'm glad to say, well established across the UK. Indeed, in February, we will introduce in Scotland our 13th social security benefit, the 8th that is available only here in Scotland. The new annual winter heating payment will be automatically paid to 400,000 low-income households. And of course, we already provide a heating payment to the families of almost 20,000 severely disabled children. Another early Poverty Alliance campaign was for the minimum wage, finally introduced in 1998. And since then, you have campaigned for the living wage, the real living wage, an issue that has rightly got far greater profile now than it did even just a decade ago. You have also influenced how policy is made, consistently and rightly arguing that people who experience the impact of policy must be much more centrally involved in the making and developing of that policy. And that's a point that my government has tried, not always perfectly, I readily concede, but has tried to take to heart and to make sure that we implement in how we go about making policy. And perhaps the best example of that is the establishment of the Social Security Experience Panels, people who influence every aspect of the development of our social security system, from policy right through to the form of the applications and the very application forms that people have to complete. So through these efforts and countless more along the way, the Poverty Alliance has helped secure significant and lasting change. So one of the first things I really want to say to all of you today is a very heartfelt thank you for all of that work that you have done. Throughout virtually my entire political career, I've seen with my own eyes firsthand just what a big difference the Poverty Alliance has made. You have changed the lives of very many people for the better. And I think that is something to be really proud of. Not every organisation can make that claim. This organisation certainly can. Despite all of that hard work, though, all of us know that we live in a society today where too many people still suffer the effects of poverty. And that is not something any of us should ever be comfortable with. And so as long as we have anyone in our society living in poverty, particularly children living in poverty, all of us, not least those of us privileged to hold positions of government office, have a big job of work still to do. That job of work today is possibly harder than it has been for some time, just as was the case in the early 1990s. We now are in an era of double-digit inflation. The country is again in a recession. The Bank of England predict that recession may last for some time. Last week, the Office of Budget Responsibility predicted that average disposable household incomes will fall by 7% in real terms in the next 2 years. That's an extraordinary burden that so many people across the country are going to have to bear. And it's a price that is being paid by everyone across the country, but disproportionately by those who are already the poorest for what I would argue very strongly is the economic, financial and fiscal incompetence of the current UK government. It's the price of underinvestment in public services and underinvestment in sustainable economic growth, particularly during the years of deeply damaging austerity. It is also the price not just of Brexit, but of a very hard Brexit that is damaging the economy and contributing to much of what we are dealing with today. And it is, of course, a price that will fall especially heavily on people in poverty or who are about to be pushed into poverty as a result of all of these factors. Now, as all of you know, and I don't say this as an excuse, I'm going to come on to talk in some detail about the work the Scottish Government is doing to try to combat poverty and lift people out of poverty. But as you know, our powers are not unlimited. We have a largely fixed budget which has been eroded quite substantially this year by inflation. We don't have extensive borrowing powers. We don't control the energy markets. We don't have the ability to tax windfall profits or introduce, for example, a wealth tax in our society. So we are to a large extent, far too large extent, it won't surprise you to hear, is my view, dependent on the actions and the decisions and the priorities of UK governments. The UK government, in the autumn statement set out by the Chancellor last week, I'm pleased to say, showed a bit more concern for equality than had previously been the case. For example, it finally confirmed that social security benefits would rise in line with inflation. But given the scale of the crisis that we're facing right now, for far too many people in communities across the country, what was announced last week was woefully inadequate. And I do think there is a contrast here. Last week, at the start of the week, I visited Whitehill Secondary and Golf Hill Primary School in a shared campus here in Glasgow. And that visit was to mark the extension of the Scottish Child Payment to all eligible children up to age 16. The payment at the start of last week was also increased to £25 per week for every eligible child. And remember, not that long ago, we introduced the child payment at the value of £10 per week. That has been widely hailed, and I think rightly hailed, as a game changer in the fight against child poverty, including by this organisation, which has rightly urged the UK government to follow suit. And taken together with other policies such as the expansion of childcare, the ongoing extension of free school meals, it is a real cornerstone of our commitment to tackle poverty and child poverty in particular. And we've prioritised this payment as far as we can in some of the toughest financial circumstances imaginable. And we've done that because we recognise how fundamental it is to the lives of children right now, but also to future generations of children. This is perhaps the biggest and most important investment in the future that any government could be making. I wish the UK government would follow suit, and will continue to press them to do so. But because it's not yet doing so, we're having to do that within, as I say, a fixed budget. And to achieve that, we've had to make some difficult choices. The budget that we have this year, as I said earlier on, is right now worth £1.7 billion less than it was when we set that budget at the start of this year. That's the impact of inflation. And we don't have any levers to try to mitigate that in year. Although we have limited tax varying powers, which we'll consider in terms of setting our budget for next year, we are legally not allowed to use them in the middle of a financial year. So we don't have the option to increase income tax, for example, to raise more revenue. We can't borrow money for day-to-day spending, and all of our reserves are fully allocated. So to balance the books and deal with that 1.7 billion inflationary impact, and to enable us to continue to allocate the money for policies like the child payment, we've had to take some really difficult decisions. We did an emergency budget review. One of the things we did in that, which was difficult and controversial and attracted criticism, understandably, was to reduce some of our support for employability services. As I say, that was not an easy decision, but given the immediate difficulties people are facing, we took the view that it was right to prioritise even more urgent forms of support. So that decision, along with the others we had to take, has helped us not just ensure we could move ahead with the extension of the child payment, it also helped us double the final bridging payment for about 150,000 families ahead of the extension of the child payment. It allowed us to maintain other forms of support, make more money available for public sector pay settlements, and take some other additional steps, such as doubling the Fuel Insecurity Fund and providing councils with more money for discretionary housing payments. So these are, I think, important decisions for us to have taken, but in a fixed budget, we do have to make some difficult choices in order to support decisions that get help and support to people who need it most. Now, those decisions we're taking to try to help people as far as we can with the cost crisis now are consistent with that longer-term approach to help lift people out of poverty. Right now, in any year, the Scottish Government invests around £3 billion on measures to mitigate the impact of rising costs, but also to help us with that longer-term objective of lifting people out of poverty. And it's worth noting that more than £1 billion of that £3 billion annual allocation is on measures that are not available in any other part of the UK, which is an indication of the priority we are attaching to lifting people out of poverty. Child payment is the most obvious example of that, but that is one of 5 family benefits we've introduced. Another is the Carers Allowance Supplement, which means that for 90,000 carers across the country, there's almost £500 a year more available in support than is the case for carers elsewhere in the UK. And these new social security payments come with a new approach that we have sought to introduce, one that doesn't rely in our social security system on the cruelty of sanctions, but instead seeks to respect the dignity of people who rely on social security. Earlier this month, when we published a review of what service users thought about Social Security Scotland, that found that 94% believed they had been treated with kindness. And considering that system will reach around 1 million people through Scottish benefits, that is really important. And that's as it should be. Everybody contributes in some way or another to the society that we are all part of. We all contribute in different ways at different times in our lives. And every single one of us don't know the moment when we might need support from the social security system. So it's really important that we see it as something belonging to all of us. It's not about charity or handouts. It's our collective investment in what it means to be part of a civilised society. And therefore, dignity and kindness and respect should absolutely be the cornerstone values of any system. Now, I've spent a bit of time talking about social security and direct payments so far because they are vital tools in tackling poverty. But a true national mission to tackle poverty, which this organisation has at its core, has to be much more all-embracing than that. It has to cover all parts of the public sector and all parts of society. So housing policy, for example, is absolutely vital. One of the reasons we recently introduced emergency legislation to freeze rents temporarily and introduce a moratorium on evictions, because we know how vital housing is to people's health, well-being and their life chances. It's also why housing supply matters and why we've made significant investment in homes for social rent. Last year, just to put this into context, per head of population, the number of homes built for social rent in Scotland was 9 times the number in England. Again, an indication of the sense of priorities that we're bringing to bear. We're also taking steps to ensure that people from backgrounds that might traditionally be seen as deprived know that they can have a fair chance in life. The promise that we've made to people with experience of care is an example of that. So is our work on closing the educational attainment gap and our decision to set widening access targets for higher education. And we also recognise, as the Poverty Alliance has been saying for 30 years, that pay, how much people get paid for the work that they do, is absolutely crucial in addressing poverty, lifting people out of poverty and giving people a decent standard of living. That's why we are doing everything we can right now to support fair public sector pay settlements. Paying higher wages is the biggest contribution we can make to help households with soaring costs, but it also helps government. People who get paid more pay more taxes. More taxes means more revenue to government. It is a virtuous cycle, which is why in the emergency budget review we reprioritised £700 million to support the fairest possible pay deals. Now, many of these negotiations are ongoing. They are difficult because trade unions are rightly demanding the best for their members. But the benefit of that is today, as nurses announce strike dates in England, their union here in Scotland has a new and improved pay deal to consider. So that's the benefit of prioritising the things that matter most to people. We encourage fair pay in the private sector as well through living wage accreditation schemes. We're now applying fair work criteria, including payment of the living wage, when we make as government choices about which businesses should get public sector grants or contracts. Recent data suggests that 90% of employees in Scotland are now being paid the living wage, more than any other part of the UK. That's good progress, but there's still so much to do. That said, it does suggest the steps we are taking as government, but in partnership with organisations like this one, are having an impact, and they should motivate us to go further. Now, that promotion of fair work and a living wage possibly also demonstrates what I would see as one of the key lessons of the past 30 years. To truly tackle poverty, we do need to reshape the economy. That's how we address not just the impact and consequences of poverty, but address the root causes, attack the problem at source. Now, I know you'll explore some other approaches later this afternoon which have the potential to do that. For example, looking at ongoing work, which I am very, very committed to develop a minimum income guarantee and to support community wealth building. These are all really important initiatives. But our ability to do all of this is constrained by the limitations on the powers of our Parliament right now. We are dealing with a cost crisis just now that has been made worse by the UK government's economic approach, years of austerity that Scotland didn't vote for, Brexit that Scotland didn't vote for, an autumn of what I can mildly describe as economic chaos from a government that Scotland didn't vote for. In addition, the Scottish Government is so frequently having to mitigate the impact of UK government policies that people in Scotland don't support. Let me give you just one example of that. We're currently spending £87 million a year to ensure that the bedroom tax doesn't impact anybody in Scotland. Far better to have a situation where we don't have these policies introduced in the first place, rather than have to spend money to mitigate the consequences of them. So all of that leads, in my mind, to an obvious point. If our economy and our public services are suffering from policies we didn't vote for, if the Scottish Government is having to spend millions of pounds mitigating the impact of these policies, if we fundamentally disagree with how UK governments are treating those who most need help, for example, in the sanctions regime in social security and its frequent and quite shameful hostility to asylum seekers, then why should we settle for simply mitigating these things? Wouldn't it be better if we could influence and take these decisions ourselves in the first place, especially as we have demonstrated already in the shape of policies like the Scottish Child Payment, how much better we can do when we have the ability to take these decisions. Back in the 1990s, one of the reasons that Scotland voted for devolution so decisively was to stop damaging policies being imposed on us. But damaging policies are still being imposed on us, and that democratic deficit has an impact in very real and very tangible ways on our ability to tackle poverty. So I think the best way to do that is to make sure that more of these powers of decision lie in our own hands. For the moment, however, and regardless of constitutional views and of our constitutional future, my commitment and my message is clear. At the start of my remarks, I mentioned that early Poverty Alliance report and its reference to the consequences of abandonment of young people by the state. I think in many ways that phrase, the consequences of the abandonment of young people by the state, that phrase represents, if I was looking for a way to summarise, that is the phrase that represents everything that I came into politics to try to play a part in changing. And standing here 30 years later as First Minister, it also remotivates me to do everything I can and everything my government can to support those who need it most. That's why we've introduced policies like the child payment, reprioritise resources to help those in crisis, and why we seek to put such a focus on measures that will tackle poverty in the long term. But it's also why I'm conscious of how much more we still need to do to help people, not just through these current challenges, but for the longer term. And as we continue with that mission as a government, the Poverty Alliance, I know, is going to continue to play a vital role, just as you have done for these past 30 years. So I'm really grateful to all of you for your insights, your expertise, for your challenge and for your criticisms at time a crucial part of the scrutiny that is necessary to push any government forward in the right direction. You have changed lives over these past 30 years. That's something you should take great pride in, but there is still much for all of us to do. So please keep doing what you are doing, including the challenge and the criticism, so that together, collectively, we can continue to make progress to change lives for the better. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much, First Minister. I think, to say the least, a comprehensive review of the last 30 years, and good to be reminded also of some of the steps that the poverty lines have taken, some which I have to say I had forgotten about. So it's good to be... we can discuss that later, but I think I possibly am. But I think really something that came through very clearly to me in all of that is that poverty is about, or it's about the decisions that we make, or the decisions that we don't make sometimes. And I think the First Minister has illustrated some of the decisions that this government has taken to try and address poverty in Scotland. Now, we have a little bit of time, around about 10 minutes or so, maybe, I think now, maybe 10, 15 minutes for some questions. So what I'd like to see is some hands. I know that we have people watching on Zoom online as well. So questions coming in, and if I could take, I'll maybe take a couple first. If I could take the woman right in the middle. So thanks, Ash. So just right in the middle there, and then the gentleman over at the side here, Alison, if you could get him as well. I see a lot of hands, so that's good.
Thank you.
And if you say who you are and where you're from, that would be helpful too.
Okay. Good morning, First Minister. I'm Emma Jackson. I work for the debt help charity Christians Against Poverty. And I guess really just wanted to ask a question about the Scottish Child Payment. Like everybody in this room at CAP, we really warmly welcome both the increase in payment this month and the kind of further rollout to the older age groups. As you demonstrated this morning, it fundamentally matters and it makes a difference. But I guess against a backdrop of a cost of living crisis and many households facing debt and actually deductions from things like social security for council tax arrears and so on, that the payments perhaps really not going far enough. So I wanted to ask, what do you see the future of this policy in terms of both increasing uptake and also the limit that it's currently set at the moment?
Thank you, Emma. We'll maybe take one more question and then come back to the First Minister.
Yeah, hello, my name is Brian Scott from I volunteer with the Poverty Street community. What I'd like to say to the First Minister is something you don't very often hear, but it's a thank you. Both my family and myself are recipients of government policy. My oldest son is now at St Andrews University doing a master's degree, and that's a boy from Postle Park who a few years back would never have been and get a look at going to St Andrews. Also myself personally, I was diagnosed with cancer just before Christmas, and the Scottish NHS moved heaven and earth to get me diagnosed and get the operation, and without the Scottish NHS and everyone working there, I wouldn't be here today. And I look forward to the day that all the money raised in Scotland stays in Scotland, and think how much we could achieve when we achieve that. So thank you, First Minister.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Well, thanks to both Emma and Brian for those questions. They're actually very closely related. So on the Scottish Child Payment, it is, in my view, you know, the phrase that is often quoted as game-changing. I think it's life-changing, not just in the here and now, but in terms of the future and investing in lifting children out of poverty is not just an investment in those children, it's an investment in the strength of the society that we're trying to build. So it's a policy that I hope and expect will become embedded and accepted in 30 years from now. While I would hope it might not be as necessary, it is still seen as a core part of what will then be the social security safety net that we have in the country. what you say about uptake is really important, and you know, there's people in this room that will have networks across the country. Please do what you can through the organisations you represent to spread the word about it. Uptake is good, but we can still get it higher so that everybody who is eligible is able to benefit from it. We are taking a very deliberate approach through all of the benefits in Social Security Scotland. Unlike, may I say, some of what we sometimes see around Social Security is almost trying to depress uptake, we want to maximise uptake of these benefits. On the level, we introduced it at £10 a week. In 8 months, it's been increased by 150% to £25 a week. I would love to take it further. I would love to, you know, double it from that. This is where I have to be really honest with you. The Scottish Government, within that fixed, eroding budget that I spoke about, we just don't have the means to do that. Right now, the way our budget is, if we were to try to increase it further, we would have to take money from other parts of our budget that would have an impact on the children we're trying to help. So the health budget or the education budget. So you start to really rob Peter to pay. Sorry, not this Peter. No.
Thank you.
I'm also married to somebody called Peter. He might say I rob him every day of the week, but that's another matter altogether. So, you know, it's really, really difficult to do within a fixed budget, and we will try to flex and to do that as much as possible. I often think sometimes the Scottish Government can be a bit of a, I don't mean this phrase to sound as if I'm patting us on the back, but a victim of our own success. We try to do things. We try to say yes to things. And therefore, I think sometimes we contribute to a view that we are able to do everything. And sometimes I think we've got to point out a bit more just the sheer limitations of the budget, which takes me to Brian's question, and thank you very much for your kind words. We need to get to a point, in my view, where it's not just we have access to all our own resources, but we have the same flexibilities about how we manage those resources as other governments do. I'm not advocating a position where governments rely on borrowing money all the time, but borrowing is one of the flexibilities and levers that most governments use to manage their way through tough times, to manage their budget over multiple years. We don't have that ability. Right now, literally, as I said, 1.7 billion is the effective cut to our budget just because of inflation. We can't borrow to try to mitigate that. So greater flexibility allows us to have greater flexibility in policy. The last thing I would say, I suppose in response to Brian, I think there are too many politicians, not so much in Scotland, but certainly UK-wide, who have no experience of some of these issues that we're talking about. You know, frankly, their life experiences are a million miles away from the experiences we're discussing here today. Now, I'm not sitting here saying I grew up in poverty. I didn't. I was lucky. But I grew up in a community where a lot of the people around me were living in poverty. So, you know, these are the experiences that have shaped me. And you know, any politician worth their salt is going to try to use those experiences to change lives for the better. And a real example of that for me, which is an actual experience, is the one you highlight there of going to university. If there hadn't been free access to university when I was growing up, I wouldn't have gone to university because the fear of debt, you know, in my family, if there had been £9,000 a year tuition fees, it wouldn't have been possible. So I had the ability, as the first person in my family, to go to university. Largely because of that, I'm sitting here today as First Minister, and I have a fundamental belief, a really fundamental belief, that having had that opportunity, I have no right as a politician now to take it away from anybody else, which is why access to university without tuition fees is one of the core policies that I will never ever give up on, and that is based fundamentally on my own life experience, and I think that matters.
Thank you very much. Could I see some more hands? I can see lots. So, gentleman right in the middle here at the front. I'm seeing hands at the back, but I can hardly see it. And then a woman just behind as well. So two together there. And this might be the final set of questions.
First Minister, my name's Ed Archer. I come from Lanark, I represent Friends of Volunteering in Clydesdale and also the Lanark Tenants and Residents Association. My question centres around housing, and I am concerned about climate change, and I think that one important way forward would be to have all new builds, every single one, eco-friendly, whether they're in the private or in the public sector, because I think that this is a very important thing to do. For example, in the public sector, could use the house constructions, which are very important. Housing means that you can have a house that can be heated for and have light for under a couple of £100 a year. And this type of thing is very important, and I'm also concerned in the private sector that as there are many new houses have absolutely no solar panels or anything, and the people who live in them who have just afforded to get into the housing ladder are going to sink into poverty as a result.
Thanks, Ed. And then to the woman just behind you.
Good morning, First Minister. I've got a question, but just before I ask, I just wanted to say on behalf of my 8-year-old and 10-year-old, you're the role model, and today they were super excited about going to school and showing off that their mummy's going to get to meet you, so thank you for the opportunity. My question is, you mentioned in your presentation about the failure of the economic fiscal policy and the impact it's having on poverty. I know Scotland is leading on a wellbeing economy, and that obviously putting the health of the nation at the forefront rather than the economy at the forefront. Where are we in relation to a wellbeing economy and tackling the poverty?
Okay. Yeah. So Ed, I 100% agree with you on the central importance of tackling climate change. You know, if we don't tackle climate change, then we're not going to have a planet to, solve all these other problems. It is fundamental. It's also, and too often politicians make it sound as if tackling the climate change and tackling poverty, fuel poverty are in competition. They're not. They're the solutions to one are the solutions to the other. If we, have more renewable forms of energy, better energy efficiency in homes, then the cost of heating our homes will be cheaper. So we've got to do it for all these reasons. We're investing a lot in home energy efficiency. Public investment is not alone going to do everything we need to do, so we need to lever in private investment to that as well. And your point about new build and building these measures in from the start is fundamental. So we're making changes around the regulation that applies to new build and some existing housing as well. So there's a significant programme of work underway over this Parliament, but it will need to extend beyond that as well. But your point is absolutely 100% correct. And in terms of the question, well, firstly, say hi to your kids for me. The 8 and 11. 8 and 10, well, say hi to them. I'm not sure how cool it is to have me as the role model as opposed to some pop star or something, but I'm going to take that and use it to motivate myself through the day. But please pass on my good wishes to them. Your point about well-being economy is crucial. That it's well-being. It's a buzz phrase, but it really sums up what an economy should be. Economic growth is not an end in itself. An economy is a means to allow people to live decent lives. And often how we measure economic success is just not consistent with that. GDP growth, I'm not saying it's unimportant, but it doesn't necessarily measure how healthy or happy or contented people are. It values, things that are counted in GDP. Illegal drug activity, I think, is often counted in these measures, but unpaid care is not. So it doesn't value the things that are really important in society. Scotland is one of the founding governments in what's called the Wellbeing Governments Alliance. We founded it with New Zealand and Iceland. There are now many other governments part of that. There was a conference here in Glasgow earlier in the week on the wellbeing economy. So we're making big strides. We've tried to embed all of that in our national performance framework. But, and it's a big but, we are at the foothills of what we need to do to put the rhetoric around a wellbeing economy into practice, because it involves thinking about it through every single aspect of government policy. So it is very much work in progress, but what we're really committed to.
Thank you, First Minister. First Minister has allowed us to have squeeze in another question, so if I could see any other final hands, I'm going to annoy my colleagues and go to gentleman at the back and gentleman at the front, because I think you've had your hand up. So if Alison, if you could come to the front, and Ash is on her way to the back. So I think it's Terry right at the back. And if you could keep if you could just say who you are and keep your questions short. And I should say just before the first question, we also had one online, also referring to the wellbeing economy and asking, about the role of taxation and trying to move us towards that wellbeing economy. So we might want to touch on that. But if we go to, I think it's Terry at the back first.
Yep. Good morning, First Minister, and I suppose I should thank you for that wee lovely pose at the window on the way up into the
was
concert
that you?
hall. That was me.
I had no idea I was visible at that window. No. I thought it was too high up.
Believe me, you were.
And then I saw you waving, and I thought, he can't be waving at me, so I'm not going to wave back because I'll look like a prat. And then I realised you were waving at me. So anyway, so that's just a wee private discussion.
Well, thank you nonetheless. I really do appreciate it. So my name's Terry McTernan. I'm from Fergusley Park, which is a community I'm sure is known to us all. And I suppose in keeping with the theme of this year's conference, Learning from the Past for a Better Future, we certainly from Fergusley Park are, in the grand scheme of things, really quite new members to the Poverty Alliance. And I think the reason for our membership, if you like, is because throughout the pandemic in particular, we, I think, all benefited from the localism that was deployed at that point, and indeed some of the wide-reaching nature of some of the poverty-challenging initiatives that were ongoing at that time. And granted, that was all motivated, I suppose, by a very different situation against the most horrendous backdrop. People were pushed out of their comfort zones. But just, again, learning from the past for a better future, what would you think, in your mind, are the lessons that can be drawn from them in terms of that continuing wide-reaching challenging of poverty rather than going back to business as usual?
Thanks, Terry. And then just at the front.
Hi. Hello?
Yep.
Hi. My name's Fred Hessler. I'm a member of the Citizens Campaign Group Poverty Edinburgh, which was set up in the wake of the Edinburgh Poverty Commission report to work with the local council to help to eradicate poverty. And I use the word eradicate because that's my question. In the Scottish Government Child Poverty Act, when we read it, it was widely received and very welcome. However, it mentions targets, and it says that the aim of the Act was to reduce child poverty to within below 5% for persistent poverty and below 10% for the other kind of poverty. Now, you have to be judged by your targets, but given the First Minister's deep personal belief in that anyone, especially any child, should not experience poverty, is there scope for revisiting the wording and the language used in that Act of Parliament and to make a bold statement to say, no, we're not happy with reducing targets, we want to eradicate poverty, especially child poverty? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'll take that one first of all. I don't think we need to go through a legislative process. Let me be very clear. My commitment is to eradicate child poverty. The government's commitment is to eradicate it. But you've got to reduce it in order to do that. And that's why, and these targets in the Child Poverty Act, they don't go as far as we need to go, but they are not going to be easy to meet, particularly given the fact that we've got split responsibilities, and as we do one thing, we sometimes see another government take us in the other direction. And actually the reason for increasing the child payment is partly because without that we would be assessed as having no chance of meeting these policies. And even with that, we've still got a lot of work to do to meet these targets. So the targets are important to focus, and they're statutory targets. And statutory targets, governments that don't meet them can be held to account legally through that. So it is a really important focusing of government activity. But let me again be clear, it's a staging post to what we should be absolutely committed to achieving, and I am committed to achieving, which is the eradication of child poverty. So hopefully that assures you. Terry, I was actually thinking about Fergusley Park earlier this week, because I read one morning as I was scrolling through the news, it was, I think Tuesday or Wednesday, was 32 years to the day that terrible thing happened in politics. Margaret Thatcher resigned. One of the brightest days of my entire political life. And the reason I was thinking about Fergusley Park is because that was during a Westminster by-election in Paisley. I think there was the two Paisley constituencies of the by-election on the same day. And I went from university, where we just heard Margaret Thatcher had resigned, to campaigning in Fergusley Park for that by-election. And there was a real sense of jubilation in the street. So I was thinking about Fergusley Park. That is an aside to your question. I think, I feel quite depressed sometimes about this, but I think the way you framed your question is quite helpful, because it should be a motivation to not be depressed, but to use that to drive change. That 30 years on, we're facing some of the same kind of socio-economic conditions that we hoped we'd left in the past. But here we are again. So I do think those of us old enough to remember back then have to recapture some of that sense of commitment and drive and determination, and just refusal to give in to what a Tory government was trying to do to us that we had then. We have to bring that to bear now, and it's more important now than it has been in any time since then. So I think it is really important not to get depressed about it, but to actually use it to motivate ourselves to deliver the social change that we want to see. I'll comment briefly on the online question about taxation. Taxation, of course, has a massive part to play in building a wellbeing economy, so that overall we have a system of taxation that is progressive, where those who can pay the most do pay the most, and we reduce the burden on those who can't. We try to do that within the tax responsibilities we have right now. We have an income tax system that has a different structure to the UK's, where those at the top pay a bit more, those at the bottom pay a bit less. But you can't achieve that just within one tax. You've got to have the ability to do that overall. If you take income tax, for the Scottish Government to raise any kind of significant sum of money out of income tax, you have to raise tax on the majority of taxpayers, which is at the middle or bottom ends. I'm not saying we shouldn't raise tax at the very top, but because they are a relatively small group of taxpayers, you don't actually raise much revenue, even if it's right to do in principle. If we had a broader array of tax powers, so that you could introduce a tax on wealth, for example, then we would have a greater ability to align tax policy with the wellbeing economy. So it's another argument for, and in Scotland, understandably, this is all couched in the kind of constitutional argument. For me, it's just basic common sense. If you want to have maximum ability to shape the kind of society you live in, then give yourself the maximum powers and levers to do it. But yes, tax and a wellbeing economy are inextricably linked.
Great. I think we have reached the end of our questions. The First Minister has given us a bit more time than was scheduled, so I'm really grateful for that. I'm also really grateful for just the reminder of how some of the changes that we all campaign and argue for actually take place. Some of those early memories of '92 of by-elections in Renfrewshire, I remember those as well. I was at college in Paisley at the time, so was out there. And obviously I'm non-political, so I can't say how I responded to Thatcher resigning. That was back then. But I think what that does, that election in '92 that was so important for many of us in this room, And all the changes that have happened subsequently since 1999 and the establishment of the Scottish Parliament. We know that the changes that we've had that have had an impact on poverty have been things that we've fought for, that we've called for, that we've lobbied politicians for, and they've listened in Scotland. And I think that's something that we need to remember. We need to try, a quote that I'm repeating over and over again, to make hope possible rather than despair inevitable. That is our job as an anti-poverty movement and as an anti-poverty network. And I think we're very grateful to have politicians across the spectrum in Scotland, but particularly in government at the moment, who do listen and who do act on many of the things that we call for. So again, thank you, First Minister, for joining us this morning. First Minister is going to leave us now, and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen next. So thank you very much.
So we're on time. I hadn't expected us to get to almost 11 o'clock, and you've got a very well-deserved coffee break now. Thank you for your questions. I think that set the tone for the rest of our discussion today, that moment where we're looking back and learning from what we've achieved over the last 30 years, but also importantly looking forward. So after the coffee break, so coffee back where if you were lucky you got one earlier on, have a coffee and then make your way to your workshop. We've got 4 workshops this morning, all on really important topics that allow us to reflect and think about where we're going. And then after that, you'll have a lunch break. For those of you who wish to join us, we have the Poverty Alliance AGM at 1 o'clock back in this room. And then it's back into workshops at 1:30, 3 workshops in the afternoon, before a final plenary with a really great panel of speakers who have all been connected to the Poverty Alliance for some time to talk through where we go next. So enjoy the rest of the morning, enjoy your lunch, enjoy your afternoon, and we'll see you back here later on this afternoon. Thank you all very much.